The stale coffee in the Burbank diner tasted like burnt rubber mixed with regret, but Alex Foster drank it anyway, his third cup since midnight, as he stared at the stack of VHS tapes and photocopied police reports spread across the cracked vinyl booth. Outside, the November rain of 1994 Los Angeles created rivers in the gutters, washing away cigarette butts and broken dreams in equal measure. Alex had been in America for 6 months now, chasing something that most people would call an obsession, but he preferred to think of as unfinished business. The British accent that had charmed producers when he first arrived had begun to fade at the edges, replaced by the flat affect of someone who spent too much time alone in archives and morgues, searching for stories that nobody wanted told. The diner's television played a rerun of a popular crime series, the volume low but not low enough to miss the dramatic confession scene that Alex knew by heart. He'd written that scene 18 months ago, back when he still believed that fiction was just fiction, before he'd stumbled upon the newspaper clipping in his dead father's study that changed everything. The clipping was from the Riverside Herald, dated March 15, 1987, about a murder-suicide that bore an uncanny resemblance to an episode that had aired just 2 weeks prior on network television. Not inspired by, not loosely based on, but identical in details, that had never been released to the public, details that only someone with access to the actual case files could have known. The waitress, Nancy according to her name tag, refilled his cup without being asked, a small kindness in a city that ran on transaction rather than compassion. She'd stopped trying to make conversation after the first week of his nightly visits, recognizing the look of someone carrying weight that small talk couldn't lift. Alex pulled out another folder, this one from Bakersfield, California, a place most Americans couldn't find on a map, despite it being only 2 hours north. The case was from 1989, a family annihilation that had been attributed to the father's gambling debts, except the crime scene photos showed something different, something that matched perfectly with a season finale that had aired on CBS 6 months before the actual murders occurred. His contact at the Los Angeles Police Department, Detective Ray Martinez, slid into the booth across from him at exactly 2 a.m., right on schedule. Ray was one of those cops who'd seen too much to believe in coincidence anymore, his eyes permanently narrowed from 20 years of squinting at crime scenes and liars. He passed Alex a manila envelope without ceremony, the kind of exchange that would look suspicious if anyone was watching, but the diner's only other customer was passed out in a corner booth, and Nancy had learned not to see things that weren't her business. Inside the envelope were coroner's reports from 1991, officially sealed, definitely illegal to share, absolutely essential to understanding how a triple homicide in Portland had become a 2-part episode of a show that was still running in syndication. "You're playing with fire, Foster," Ray said, lighting a Marlboro despite California's new indoor smoking restrictions that nobody in this part of town enforced. "These production companies have lawyers that eat journalists for breakfast and shit out lawsuits by lunch." Alex studied the reports, his trained eye catching the inconsistencies immediately. The official cause of death didn't match the wounds described. The timeline had been altered, and someone had signed off on a report that placed the murders 3 days after they'd actually occurred, coincidentally the same day the episode had finished filming. Ray watched him read, taking long drags of his cigarette, the smoke creating a haze between them like a curtain, separating the world of the living from the world of the almost dead. "My father knew about this," Alex said finally, his voice carrying the weight of months of investigation. He was consulting for Thames Television in London when they were developing their crime series. Found connections to real cases that hadn't been solved yet, episodes that aired before the crimes were committed, patterns that suggested someone was using television as a blueprint for murder or worse, using murders as inspiration while they were still being investigated. Ray stubbed out his cigarette in the remains of Alex's coffee, the hiss and smell making them both grimace. The detective leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper despite the empty diner. "There's a producer, Marcus Webb, works out of a studio in the valley. He's been buying crime scene photos, autopsy reports, anything he can get his hands on from departments across the country. Pays cash, asks no questions, and his shows have the highest ratings in their time slots." Alex wrote the name in his notebook, his handwriting getting worse as his excitement grew. This was the connection he'd been looking for, the thread that would unravel everything if he pulled hard enough. Ray stood to leave, tossing a 20 on the table for coffee neither of them had ordered. "Be careful, Foster. The last journalist who looked into this ended up driving off Mulholland Drive on a clear night with perfect visibility. Cops ruled it an accident, but his brake lines had been cut so clean you could see your reflection in them." After Ray left, Alex sat alone with the weight of what he was uncovering. The rain had stopped, leaving Los Angeles washed and gleaming under the streetlights like a movie set between takes. He thought about his father's death, ruled a heart attack despite him having the cardiovascular health of a man half his age. He thought about the episodes he'd watched, studying them frame by frame, finding details that match crime scenes from photos that wouldn't be taken for months or years. Someone was either predicting murders with impossible accuracy or orchestrating them for the sake of ratings, and either possibility was terrifying enough to make him order another cup of coffee despite his hands already shaking from caffeine and fear. The production company Marcus Webb worked for was called Silver Screen Shadows, located in a nondescript building in Van Nuys that looked like every other failed dream in the valley. Alex drove there as the sun rose, the 101 freeway already thick with morning traffic, everyone rushing to jobs that didn't matter to make money they'd never save. The parking lot was empty, except for a black Lincoln Town car with tinted windows, the kind of car that screamed either executive or executioner, sometimes both. Alex parked his rental Ford Taurus, a car so forgettable that even he sometimes walked past it in parking lots, and made his way to the building's entrance. The lobby was decorated in what someone in 1985 had thought 1995 would look like, all chrome and glass and uncomfortable furniture that prioritized form over function. The receptionist, a young woman with big hair and bigger dreams, didn't look up from her copy of Variety until Alex cleared his throat. When he asked for Marcus Webb, her face went through a series of expressions that started at confusion, passed through recognition, and landed on fear. She said Mr. Webb wasn't taking meetings, wouldn't be taking meetings, and suggested that Alex leave his information and someone would be in touch, the kind of brush-off that meant nobody would ever call. Alex left, but not before memorizing the building's layout, the security camera positions, and the fact that the side door's lock was broken, held shut only by a piece of duct tape painted to match the doorframe. He drove to the nearest library, where he spent the afternoon researching Silver Screen Shadows, finding a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and production credits that included 7 of the 10 most successful crime series of the last decade. Every show had episodes that matched real crimes with impossible accuracy, and every show had Marcus Webb's name buried somewhere in the credits, usually as a consultant or technical advisor, titles vague enough to mean anything or nothing. That evening, Alex met with Sarah Chen, a film student at UCLA who'd been working as an intern at Silver Screen Shadows until she'd asked too many questions about where their story ideas came from. She was nervous, constantly checking over her shoulder, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. She told Alex about the locked room on the 3rd floor where only Webb and his assistant were allowed, about the weekly deliveries of packages that looked official and required signatures, about the time she'd accidentally opened one and seen crime scene photos dated 3 days in the future before Webb had snatched them away and threatened to not only fire her, but ensure she never worked in Hollywood again. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the coffee shop's jazz music. "I heard Webb on the phone once talking about the next one and giving specific details about a crime that hadn't happened yet. 2 weeks later, there was a murder in Fresno that matched everything he'd said, and 3 months after that, it was the plot of their season premiere. She slid Alex a piece of paper with an address in Riverside County and a date 2 weeks away. "I heard him mention this location and date on another call. If something happens there, if someone dies, then we'll know for sure that Webb isn't just stealing stories, he's creating them." Alex took the paper, feeling the weight of what it represented. If Sarah was right, he had 2 weeks to either prevent a murder or catch a killer in the act, and he wasn't sure which possibility scared him more. He thought about going to the police, but Ray had made it clear that Webb had connections in the department, people who would make any investigation disappear faster than evidence at a mob trial. He thought about calling the FBI, but without proof, he was just another conspiracy theorist with a British accent and a dead father complex. He thought about walking away, going back to London, writing romantic comedies or whatever paid the bills, without requiring him to stare into the abyss of human depravity. But then he thought about his father, dying alone with a secret that had probably killed him, and he knew he couldn't leave, not until he'd pulled this thread all the way to its bloody end. The Riverside County address led Alex to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Moreno Valley, a place where the American dream went to die among foreclosed homes and empty strip malls. He'd been conducting surveillance for 3 days, sleeping in his car, living on gas station coffee and beef jerky, watching nothing happen with the intensity of someone who knew that nothing was often the prelude to everything. The November heat was unseasonable even for Southern California. The Santa Ana winds, carrying the smell of distant fires and imminent danger. On the 4th night, just as Alex was beginning to doubt Sarah's information, 3 vehicles arrived in convoy, their headlights cutting through the darkness like accusations. Marcus Webb stepped out of the lead car, a man who looked exactly like his reputation suggested, expensive suit on a cheap sole, his face the kind of handsome that photographed well, but felt wrong in person. With him were 2 other men Alex didn't recognize, and a woman whose nervous movements suggested she wasn't there by choice. They entered the warehouse through a side door that had been padlocked until Webb produced a key, the sound of metal on metal echoing in the empty night. Alex waited 5 minutes, then followed, his heart pounding hard enough that he worried they might hear it through the walls. Inside, the warehouse had been transformed into something that looked like a film set dressed as a crime scene, or perhaps a crime scene dressed as a film set, the distinction becoming increasingly meaningless. There were chalk outlines on the floor, in positions that didn't make sense, unless you were staging them for cameras, blood spatter patterns on the walls that were too perfect to be accidental, and props that might have been evidence, or evidence that might have been props. Webb was directing the 2 men to adjust lighting equipment while the woman stood frozen in the center of it all, her eyes wide with a combination of fear and confusion that couldn't be acted. Alex recognized her from the missing persons report he'd pulled that morning, Jennifer Walsh, a 28-year-old bartender from Riverside who'd disappeared 3 days ago after her shift ended. The police had barely begun investigating, assuming she'd run off with a boyfriend or was sleeping off a bender somewhere, the kind of assumptions that got people killed while authorities filled out paperwork. Through a crack in the wall, Alex watched Webb hand one of the men a script, actual pages with dialogue and stage directions, and the horrifying realization hit him that they weren't just documenting crimes or predicting them, they were rehearsing them. The conversation that followed would haunt Alex for the rest of his life. Webb explained to his accomplices that the scene needed to match the episode that would air in 6 months, that the details had to be perfect because the show's authenticity was what kept viewers coming back. He talked about murder like other producers talked about lighting, with technical precision, devoid of human consideration. The woman, Jennifer, tried to run, but the warehouse doors had been locked from the inside, and her screams echoed off the metal walls like a soundtrack to a nightmare nobody would ever broadcast. Alex had to make a decision that would define not just his investigation, but his entire moral existence. He could try to intervene, probably die in the process, and save nobody, or he could document what was happening and use it to bring down Webb and his entire operation. His hands shook as he pulled out his camera, the one his father had given him for his 18th birthday, with a note that said, "Truth needs witnesses," and began recording. The click of the shutter sounded impossibly loud, but the group was too focused on their terrible rehearsal to notice. Through his lens, Alex captured Webb, directing violence like a conductor leading an orchestra of horror, each movement choreographed, each angle considered for maximum dramatic impact. Just as Webb was explaining how the actual murder would need to deviate slightly from the script to avoid suspicion, police sirens wailed in the distance. Everyone froze, and in that moment of stillness, Alex saw his chance. He kicked open the emergency exit he'd identified during his surveillance, triggering an alarm that pierced the night like a scream. The sudden chaos gave Jennifer the distraction she needed to break free, running toward the exit as Webb and his accomplices scrambled to gather their equipment. Alex grabbed Jennifer's arm as she passed, pulling her through the door and into the night, both of them running toward his car as shouts erupted behind them. They drove without stopping for 50 miles, Jennifer crying silently in the passenger seat, while Alex tried to process what he'd witnessed. He'd saved her life, but the evidence on his camera would damn him as much as Webb if anyone questioned why he'd been there, why he'd waited, why he'd photographed instead of immediately intervening. The moral complexity of his choices sat like lead in his stomach as they pulled into a police station in San Bernardino, far enough from Riverside that Webb's connections might not reach. Jennifer's testimony, combined with Alex's photographs, should have been enough to launch an investigation, but the detective who took their statement seemed more interested in why a British journalist happened to be at an abandoned warehouse in the middle of the night than in the attempted murder they were reporting. The next morning, Alex woke to find his motel room had been searched while he slept, his cameras and notebooks gone, replaced with a single note that read, "Next time you won't wake up." He called Ray Martinez, but the number had been disconnected. He tried Sarah Chen, but she didn't answer. He even called the British consulate, but they suggested he might want to consider returning to London for his own safety, the kind of diplomatic speak that meant they couldn't or wouldn't help. Jennifer had disappeared from the police station sometime during the night, the detective claiming she'd left voluntarily, though the security footage that might have shown otherwise had mysteriously corrupted. Alone and without his evidence, Alex did the only thing he could think of. He went public. He contacted Kelly Morrison, an investigative reporter for the Los Angeles Times who'd been covering entertainment industry scandals since the days when they still called them casting couches instead of systemic abuse. Kelly met him at a restaurant in Pasadena, a place full of families and normal people living normal lives, the kind of witnesses that made violence impractical. She listened to his story with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd heard everything and believed nothing until proven, her tape recorder running while she took notes in shorthand that looked like arcane symbols. "You realize what you're alleging?" Kelly asked when he'd finished. "You're saying that one of the most successful television producers in Hollywood is commissioning murders to create authentic content. That's not just criminal, it's insane." Alex nodded, understanding how it sounded, but unable to make it sound any different without lying. Kelly studied him for a long moment, then pulled out a folder of her own. Inside were clippings dating back 5 years. Suspicious deaths that matched television episodes, missing persons who resembled characters who died on screen, patterns that she'd noticed but hadn't been able to prove. "I've been tracking this for years," she admitted. "But every time I get close to something concrete, my sources disappear or recant, and my editors suddenly decide the story isn't worth pursuing." They formed an alliance born of necessity and desperation. Two people who'd seen too much to pretend they hadn't, even if pretending would have been safer. Kelly had resources and credibility that Alex lacked, while Alex had the kind of obsessive focus that came from personal loss and the willingness to risk everything because he'd already lost what mattered most. They spent the next week gathering new evidence, interviewing former employees of Silver Screen Shadows who would only speak off the record, building a case that was circumstantial but overwhelming in its cumulative weight. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a forensic psychologist who'd consulted for various crime shows, reached out after hearing through professional channels that someone was investigating the industry's dark practices. She'd noticed patterns in the crimes depicted on screen that suggested inside knowledge, not just of police procedures, but of victims' psychological profiles, information that could only have come from sealed therapy records or psychiatric evaluations. She'd raised concerns with the production companies, but had been told that their writers were just very thorough in their research, an explanation that had never satisfied her. Patricia provided Alex and Kelly with something invaluable, a paper trail. She'd kept copies of every consultation report she'd filed, every request for information she'd received, every payment that had been made through shell companies that traced back to Webb's operation. The documents showed a clear pattern of Webb's people accessing confidential medical records, identifying vulnerable individuals who fit certain profiles, people whose deaths wouldn't be thoroughly investigated, whose stories could be appropriated without consequence. It was victim selection on an industrial scale, turning human tragedy into entertainment product with the efficiency of an assembly line. Armed with this new evidence, Kelly pitched the story to her editors again, this time with enough documentation to make killing it impossible without raising questions. The Los Angeles Times agreed to run a series of articles, but only after their legal team had reviewed everything and removed anything that could trigger a lawsuit. What remained was still damaging enough to destroy Webb's reputation, if not his freedom. The first article was set to run on Monday, giving them the weekend to prepare for whatever retaliation might come. That Saturday night, Alex received a call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was Webb himself, calm and conversational, like they were discussing weekend plans instead of life and death. "You think you're the hero of this story," Webb said, "but you're just another character, and I've written your ending already." He went on to explain that Alex's father had discovered the same truth years ago, had tried to expose it, and had paid the price. "Heart attacks are easy to induce if you know the right chemicals," Webb said casually. "Your father died thinking about you, wondering if you'd be smart enough to leave this alone. Guess he overestimated you." The Los Angeles Times article hit the newsstands on Monday morning like a bomb wrapped in newsprint. The headline, "Death for Ratings, Inside Hollywood's Darkest Secret," running across the front page in letters that seemed to scream. Within hours, 3 major networks had pulled Silver Screen Shadows productions from their schedules, and Marcus Webb's lawyers had filed 17 different lawsuits against the Times, Kelly Morrison, and Alex Foster, who was named as a primary source despite attempts to keep his identity protected. The ensuing media circus turned ugly fast, with Hollywood closing ranks to protect one of their own, while victims' families demanded investigations that the police seemed reluctant to pursue. Alex found himself in the center of a storm he'd created but couldn't control. His motel room became a bunker, the parking lot outside filled with news vans and photographers hoping to catch him in an unguarded moment. The British press had picked up the story, painting him alternately as a crusading hero or an unstable conspiracy theorist, depending on their editorial stance. His mother called from London crying, begging him to come home, to leave this American madness behind before it consumed him like it had consumed his father. But Alex couldn't leave, not when Webb was still free, not when the full truth remained buried beneath layers of legal threats and industry protection. The first assassination attempt came disguised as room service on Tuesday night. Alex had ordered nothing, But the knock came anyway, and something about the silence that followed made him drop to the floor just as bullets tore through the door where his head had been. He crawled to the bathroom, called 911 from the phone by the toilet, and listened to the footsteps retreat down the hallway as sirens approached. The police who responded treated it as a random shooting, despite the precision of the shots and the fact that no other rooms had been targeted. Detective Martinez had been right about one thing. Webb had connections everywhere, and they were closing in. Kelly Morrison refused to be intimidated, publishing a follow-up article that included the psychiatric records Patricia Hendricks had provided, showing how Webb's productions had targeted specific individuals for their vulnerability. The article revealed that Jennifer Walsh, the woman Alex had saved, had been selected because she'd been in therapy for anxiety, making her both an ideal victim and an unreliable witness if she survived. The public response was immediate and visceral, with protesters gathering outside Silver Screen Shadow's offices, demanding justice for victims whose deaths had been turned into entertainment. But Webb had played this game longer and better than any of them anticipated. His lawyers held a press conference where they presented Alex as a disturbed individual with a history of mental health issues, something that was technically true given the therapy he'd sought after his father's death, but completely unrelated to the validity of his investigation. They painted Kelly as a washed-up journalist desperate for one last big story, and Patricia as a disgruntled consultant who'd been fired for inappropriate behavior, a complete fabrication that nonetheless made headlines. The narrative was shifting, the truth becoming negotiable, malleable, something that could be edited like a script until it told whatever story the powerful wanted told. Sarah Chen reappeared after 2 weeks of silence, but she was different. Scared in a way that went beyond normal fear into something closer to resignation. She met Alex at a public park in broad daylight, surrounded by joggers and dog walkers, witnesses to nothing more than 2 people sitting on a bench. She told him that Webb's people had visited her family, had made it clear that her parents' restaurant could burn down accidentally, that her younger brother could disappear on his way home from school, that there were so many ways for tragedy to strike if she continued to cooperate with the investigation. She was leaving Los Angeles, leaving California, possibly leaving the country, and she suggested Alex do the same. "He's not just a producer," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "He's connected to something bigger, older, darker than just television. There are others like him in different industries, turning real horror into consumable content, and they protect each other. You've rattled the cage, but you haven't opened it, and they won't let you." She handed him a flash drive, saying it contained everything she'd managed to copy from Webb's files before she'd been discovered, then walked away without looking back. Another casualty of truth in a city built on beautiful lies. The flash drive contained horrors that Alex wished he could unsee. Production notes that detailed murders yet to be committed, demographic studies on which types of victims generated the highest ratings, correspondence with other producers discussing the management of reality to create more compelling narratives. There were financial records showing payments to corrupt cops, judges, and journalists who'd helped cover up the truth or discredit those who tried to expose it. Most damning was a video file, a recording of a meeting where Webb and 5 other producers discussed their plan to create a true crime series that would be more authentic than anything ever broadcast by making the crimes real but untraceable. Alex knew he needed to get this information to someone who could act on it without being corrupted or intimidated. The FBI seemed like the logical choice, but Webb's reach into law enforcement made that risky. The press was already doing what they could, but the legal threats were mounting, and even the Los Angeles Times was beginning to hedge their coverage. He decided to take the most dangerous route possible. He would go directly to the victims' families, give them the evidence they needed to pursue civil cases that could succeed where criminal prosecution had failed. The first family he contacted was the Johnsons, whose daughter had been murdered in a way that exactly matched an episode that had aired 3 years prior. They met at their home in Pasadena, a modest house filled with photographs of a girl who'd never get to grow old. Mrs. Johnson cried as she looked through the evidence, seeing her daughter's death transformed into entertainment, her final moments scripted and staged for maximum impact. Mr. Johnson was quieter, his anger cold and focused, the kind that would burn for years without diminishing. They took copies of everything, promising to share it with other families who'd lost loved ones to Webb's manufactured reality. Within a week, 17 families had formed a coalition, filing a massive civil suit against Silver Screen Shadows, Webb personally, and the networks that had aired the shows. The lawsuit alleged not just wrongful death, but conspiracy, racketeering, and violation of human rights on a scale that made headlines around the world. The evidence Alex had provided gave them something the criminal justice system had lacked: clear motive and method, showing how their loved ones' deaths had been commodified for profit. The court of public opinion turned decisively against Webb, with advertisers pulling out and actors refusing to work on any production associated with him. Webb's response was swift and brutal. 3 of the families received death threats detailed enough to be taken seriously. Kelly Morrison's car exploded in her driveway, though she'd been inside getting her keys, a timing that saved her life, but destroyed her sense of safety. Patricia Hendricks was arrested on fabricated drug charges that would take months to disprove, her reputation destroyed in the meantime. And Alex found himself framed for a crime he hadn't committed. Security footage allegedly showing him breaking into Webb's office, though he'd been 300 miles away at the time. The frame job was sophisticated enough that even Alex's allies began to doubt him. The footage was convincing. The timestamp matched credit card records that had somehow been altered to place him in Los Angeles when he'd actually been in San Francisco following another lead. His arrest made international news. The British journalist who'd exposed Hollywood's darkest secret, now accused of being part of it. The irony wasn't lost on him as he sat in a holding cell, watching through barred windows as the world decided whether he was a hero or a villain, not realizing that in Webb's productions, those roles were often played by the same person. Kelly worked tirelessly to prove Alex's innocence, using her journalistic skills to track down the digital manipulation expert who'd created the fake footage. It took her 2 weeks and cost her most of her savings, but she found him, a young programmer named David Kim, who'd been paid $50,000 to create evidence that would destroy Alex's credibility. David was willing to testify in exchange for immunity, his conscience finally overcoming his greed when he realized he'd been helping frame an innocent man to protect a killer. The charges against Alex were dropped, but the damage was done. His credibility was shot, his investigation painted as the obsession of a man who'd gone too far, crossed too many lines, become the monster he'd been hunting. Even those who believed him began to distance themselves, afraid of being caught in the crossfire of a war between truth and power that truth was clearly losing. Webb remained free, his lawyers having successfully argued that the evidence against him was circumstantial, obtained illegally, or simply fabricated by a conspiracy theorist with a grudge. But the families didn't give up. They continued their civil suit, using the court system to slowly extract truth through depositions and discovery. Every document Webb's lawyers were forced to produce revealed more connections, more crimes, more victims whose stories had been stolen and sold. The case would take years to resolve, but it was a start. A crack in the facade that might eventually bring the whole structure down. Alex watched from the sidelines, his part in the story seemingly over, though he knew better than to believe in endings when Webb was still writing the script. 2 years had passed since the failed criminal prosecution, and Los Angeles had moved on to new scandals, the city's appetite for outrage as cyclical as pilot season. Alex Foster remained in America, unable to leave despite multiple attempts, each time finding his visa mysteriously extended or his departure delayed by bureaucratic complications that reeked of Webb's influence. He lived now in a small apartment in Koreatown, teaching English as a second language to immigrants who knew nothing of his past, finding peace in their simple desire to communicate in a new land while he struggled to make sense of his own story. The civil trial had been grinding through the court system with the speed of continental drift, each hearing bringing small revelations that the media barely covered anymore. Webb had retreated from public view but hadn't disappeared. His production company restructured under new names, but essentially unchanged, still creating content that danced on the edge of exploitation. 3 more families had joined the lawsuit after recognizing their tragedies in recent episodes, the pattern continuing despite the scrutiny, as if Webb was daring someone to stop him. On a humid Thursday evening in September 1996, Alex received a call that changed everything. Jennifer Walsh, the woman he'd saved from Webb's warehouse, had been found dead in her apartment in Arizona, where she'd moved to escape the memories. The official cause was suicide, but the details didn't add up. She'd been in therapy, rebuilding her life, had just gotten engaged, and had left no note. More troubling was that her death matched exactly a script Alex had seen on Webb's flash drive, a future episode about a survivor who couldn't live with what she'd survived. It was Webb's final insult, killing the one person Alex had managed to save, proving that his reach extended beyond California, beyond the industry, into the lives of anyone who defied him. Alex made a decision that night that would have horrified the man he'd been 2 years ago. If the system wouldn't deliver justice, he would create his own. He began by reconnecting with the network of victims' families, not through lawyers or official channels, but in living rooms and coffee shops, building something that existed outside the corrupted structures of law and media. Together, they compiled everything they knew about Webb's operation, creating a database of his associates, his methods, his vulnerabilities. It wasn't about revenge, they told themselves, but about prevention, about ensuring no more families would join their terrible fellowship. Kelly Morrison had never stopped investigating, though her editors had long since forbidden her from publishing anything related to Webb. She worked nights and weekends, following paper trails and interviewing sources the police had ignored or dismissed. She discovered that Webb's network extended internationally, with similar operations in Vancouver, London, and Sydney, all producing true crime content with suspicious authenticity. The scale of it suggested not just corruption, but an entire shadow industry built on turning human suffering into entertainment. She shared everything with Alex, their partnership now completely off the books, 2 people united by a truth that nobody wanted to hear. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus Webb's assistant, a woman named Rebecca Palmer, who'd been with him for 7 years, reached out through intermediaries. She was dying of cancer, given 3 months to live, and wanted to clear her conscience. She met with Alex in the oncology ward at Cedars-Sinai, her body ravaged by disease, but her memory sharp as a scalpel. She told him everything about Webb's operation, the murders they'd commissioned, the evidence they'd destroyed, the people they'd had killed to protect their secret. She gave him names, dates, locations, and most importantly, she gave him the location of Webb's real files, not the ones in his office, but the ones he kept in a storage unit in Riverside, believing them safe from any official investigation. Alex and Kelly drove to Riverside that night, knowing they were probably being watched, probably walking into a trap, but unable to resist the possibility of finally finding proof that couldn't be dismissed or destroyed. The storage unit was in an industrial area, surrounded by nothing but empty lots and abandoned buildings, the kind of place where people could disappear without anyone noticing. They broke in using skills Alex had never wanted to learn, but had acquired out of necessity, their flashlights revealing boxes of horrors that exceeded even their worst expectations. There were photographs of crime scenes that hadn't been reported, videos of murders that had been staged to look like accidents or suicides, contracts with hitmen disguised as consulting agreements, and correspondence that revealed Webb was just middle management in something much larger. The true crime entertainment industry wasn't just inspired by reality, it was creating reality, manufacturing tragedies to feed an insatiable appetite for authentic horror. The files went back decades, suggesting this had been happening since the birth of television, each generation of producers passing down their methods like a corrupted inheritance. As they documented everything, uploading files to multiple cloud servers and sending copies to journalists around the world, they heard vehicles approaching. Webb had been watching, waiting, letting them find the evidence because he had something worse planned. The warehouse was surrounded within minutes, not by police, but by private security, the kind that asked no questions and left no witnesses. Alex and Kelly barricaded themselves inside the storage unit, using the boxes of evidence as shields while they continued uploading, determined to get the truth out, even if they didn't survive to see its impact. The standoff lasted 3 hours, with Webb himself eventually arriving to negotiate. He stood outside the storage unit, his voice carrying through the thin metal walls, offering them a deal. They could walk away, leave the country, never speak of this again, and live comfortable lives funded by his organization. Or they could die here, be found with planted evidence of their own crimes, and be remembered as the criminals they'd tried to expose. It was the same deal he'd offered Alex's father, he revealed, a deal his father had refused, choosing death over complicity. Alex made a different choice. He'd learned something from 2 years of fighting Webb, that the man's greatest weakness was his ego, his need to be recognized as the genius he believed himself to be. So instead of refusing or accepting, Alex offered a counter-proposal. He would write Webb's story, the true story, not as an exposé but as a confession, a memoir of America's most successful serial killer, produced and distributed by Webb himself. It would be the ultimate true crime series, the killer telling his own story, taking credit for everything he'd done. Webb's ego wrestled with his survival instinct, the desire for recognition, fighting against the need for secrecy. While Webb considered the offer, the uploads finished. Everything was now in the hands of journalists, lawyers, and activists around the world, people Webb couldn't all reach, couldn't all corrupt or intimidate. Kelly had also triggered a dead man's switch. If they didn't check in within 24 hours, the files would be automatically sent to every major news outlet, every law enforcement agency, every victim's family. Webb could kill them, but he couldn't kill the truth anymore, not when it existed in so many places, in so many hands. The police arrived at dawn, real police this time. Not Webb's corrupted contacts, but federal agents who'd been monitoring the situation. The FBI had been building their own case, it turned out, using Alex and Kelly's investigation as a roadmap while maintaining official distance. The storage unit's contents provided the physical evidence they'd needed, and Rebecca Palmer's testimony, recorded from her hospital bed, gave them witness corroboration. Webb was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and running a criminal enterprise that spanned decades and crossed international borders. The trial became the most watched event in television history, the ultimate true crime story, a producer who'd killed for content finally becoming content himself. Webb maintained his innocence even as his associates turned state's evidence, each revelation more damning than the last. The victims' families finally had their day in court, telling their stories to a jury that could barely comprehend the scale of the horror. Alex testified for 3 days, his British accent now permanently tinged with American inflections, his story of a son seeking justice for his father resonating even with those who'd once dismissed him as a conspiracy theorist. Webb was convicted on all charges, sentenced to life in prison without parole, though everyone knew he'd probably die before serving even a fraction of his sentence. His network was dismantled, his associates prosecuted or fled, his legacy destroyed. The true crime genre itself faced a reckoning, with new regulations and oversight designed to prevent reality from being manufactured for entertainment. It wasn't perfect justice. Some people had gotten away, some victims would never be acknowledged. But it was more than Alex had dared hope for when he'd started this journey. In the end, Alex did write the story, not as Webb's biography, but as his own, a memoir called Scripted Reality that became an international bestseller. He donated most of the proceeds to the victims' families and used the rest to establish a foundation that investigated suspicious deaths that matched entertainment content. Kelly won a Pulitzer for her reporting, though she said the real prize was knowing they'd saved lives by exposing the truth. The families found some measure of peace, though nothing could bring back their loved ones or undo the horror of knowing their deaths had been entertainment for millions. Alex returned to London eventually, his visa finally expired, his work in America complete. He visited his father's grave, telling him the whole story, how he'd finished what his father had started, how justice had been served even if it had come too late for some. He continued to write, but now he wrote fiction, creating stories that were entirely imagined, finding freedom in invention after years of being imprisoned by truth. Sometimes he'd get emails from other journalists, other investigators, asking for advice about cases that seemed too strange to be real, and he'd always respond with the same warning his father should have heeded, and he'd learned too late. Some stories are true precisely because they seem impossible, and the most dangerous criminals are those who control the narrative. The entertainment industry slowly recovered from the scandal, implementing safeguards and oversight that should have existed from the beginning. True crime content continued to be popular, but now there were strict protocols about verifying that the crimes being depicted had actually been solved, that the victims' families had consented, that reality wasn't being shaped to fit narrative demands. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was better than the Wild West of exploitation that Webb had represented. Alex watched from afar as Hollywood tried to rehabilitate its image, knowing that somewhere, in some office, another Marcus Webb was probably planning another scheme, because that's what happened when profit mattered more than people, when ratings justified any means, when truth became just another product to be packaged and sold. But for now, there was peace. The families had their closure, the criminals had their sentences, and the truth had its day. Alex Foster had started as a grieving son looking for answers about his father's death, and had ended as something he'd never intended to become. A hero in a story that should never have needed one. He'd learned that justice wasn't about winning or losing, but about the fight itself, about refusing to let lies become history, about standing up to power even when power held all the cards. His father would have been proud, he thought, not of what he'd accomplished, but of what he'd refused to accept, that some stories are too important to let villains write the ending.